Chapter 10, Granny Comes Back. Curiously, Granny wasn't actually dead. This is what had happened. She had indeed been taken ill with a bad cold and, before she had even sneezed twice, she had telephoned for an ambulance to take her to hospital. By the time the ambulance men had arrived, she had decided she was too ill even to walk and had insisted on being carried to the waiting vehicle. It was then that something very unfortunate had taken place. As the ambulance men carried her out of the block of flats, a neighbour had chanced to walk past and asked them if they knew the time. Both ambulance men had lifted their wrists to look at their watches. In doing so, they unwittingly tilted the stretcher. This was a bad mistake. Granny gave a little scream and rolled off the stretcher, falling straight into a large puddle. The result was that by the time she arrived at the hospital, Granny's cold really had developed into a mild form of pneumonia, and she had to be given a bed. Even so, her illness was not life-threatening. The doctors were sure she would be able to go home in a day or two, and left her quite happily sitting up in bed with a furry knitted jacket and the latest copy of Hello magazine. Now, Granny had been placed in an ordinary public ward, in the geriatric wing. There were 8 beds there, and each one was occupied. Indeed, one bed actually had 2 elderly people in it, lying head to foot and foot to head. As ever, the National Health Service was finding it hard to cope. But despite the crowding, the nurses and doctors were as cheerful as possible, working long hours into the night, and nobody complained. Nobody, that is, except for the woman in the bed next to Granny. Her name was Marjorie Henslow, and she was a retired headmistress. Having spent her whole working life telling people what to do, she hadn't allowed retirement to stop her. She treated the nurses, the cleaners, and her fellow patients like children, her face frozen in a permanent sneer of disapproval. She was a woman with opinions about everything and expressed them at all times of the day and night. Mrs. Thatcher? A wonderful woman. She showed them in the Gulf War. That's what the train drivers need. A few exocet missiles would soon show them up, that's what. I'd blow them all up, and the miners. I say we should close all the pits down. What's wrong with the nuclear energy? Let's drop nuclear bombs on the miners and the teachers and the train drivers. Bing, bang, boom. When I was a headmistress, I used to flog everyone. It never did them any harm. I even used to flog the other members of staff, and I flogged dead horses. Why not? A bit more flogging would put the great back into Britain. This went on 24 hours a day. Mrs. Henslow even talked in her sleep. It was hardly surprising that she was alone. In the ward, had no flowers or grapes. Nobody visited her. Nobody liked her. One evening she got talking to Granny. "This is a horrible place," she said. "I wouldn't come here if I wasn't ill. These nurses, some of them are coloured, you know. Not that I'm racist, but, well, the Nazis did have some good ideas." "I suppose so," Granny agreed. "This ward is so drab and uncomfortable." Mrs. Henslow leant towards Granny. "Well, tomorrow I'm moving to a different hospital." "Are you?" Granny quavered. "Oh, yes. You see, I have private medical insurance. Well, there was some sort of mix-up and it's taken them a few days to sort it out. But tomorrow I'm off to a private hospital outside London, and I won't miss this place, I can tell you." "Lucky you," Granny scowled. It had to be said that the ward wasn't the most comfortable of places. "I am lucky. Tomorrow I'll have my own private room with a colour television and a nice view. The food there is absolutely delicious, I'm told. Bought in fresh from Harrods Food Hall. You actually get a menu, not like here." Granny thought back to her lunch that day. It had been battered fish. It had been served underneath a battered tin dish. It hadn't been very hot, and it hadn't been very nice. "I've heard this hospital is so nice," Mrs. Henslow went on, "that people actually make themselves ill to get in there. My neighbour's wife cut off her hand to be admitted, and she said it was worth every finger." Mrs. Henslow smiled. "Of course, I'm sure you'll get better eventually here. The NHS is wonderful, really, if you're too poor to afford better." By now, Granny was dark red with anger, and when the doctor came round later, it was discovered that her temperature had gone up to 105. Everyone assumed, of course, that it was her pneumonia that had caused the rise. The doctor doubted she would even live to see the next day, and this is what he had reported to Mr. and Mrs. Worden, who in turn had called in all the relatives. But as it turned out, it was Mrs. Henslow who suddenly took a turn for the worse during the night and quite unexpectedly died. Granny was lying awake. She was too angry to sleep. and actually heard the other lady breathe her last. And that was what gave her the idea. Granny had been perfectly content in the public ward until Mrs. Henslow had described the hospital she was being transferred to. Food from Harrods, colour TV and a view. Why couldn't she go there? Why couldn't she? Granny gazed at the still and silent figure in the next bed. By chance, Mrs. Henslow was wearing a very similar nightie to her own. She was about the same age, and it was true, was it not, that one very old lady in bed with the sheets drawn up to her chin looks very much like the next. Mrs. Henslow had no relatives or visitors to give the game away. The nurses and doctors had for the most part avoided her. Nobody had examined her that closely, so why not? Why not indeed? And so it was that Granny swapped beds with Mrs. Henslow, and the following morning it was Mrs. Henslow's death that was reported to Mr. and Mrs. Worden, while Granny, her eyes peeping out over the sheet, was carried into a waiting ambulance and transferred to the private hospital. And for the next few days, while Mrs. Henslow was buried in the raging storm, it was Granny who reclined on duck-down pillows watching her own 22-inch colour television whilst popping grapes, lychees and other exotic fruits between her lips. It didn't even matter when she forgot to answer to the name of Mrs. Henslow. She was old, she was ill, she was bound to be confused. Nobody noticed. It had all gone exactly according to plan. There was an awkward silence at breakfast the next day. Mr. and Mrs. Worden hadn't slept a wink, and it showed. Mr. Worden had eaten his muesli dry and then poured half a pint of milk over his toast and marmalade. Mrs. Worden had cleaned her teeth with her husband's shaving foam and was quite literally frothing at the mouth. For his part, Joe hadn't intended to come down to breakfast, but he was fed up of being ill and wanted to get back to school, which meant he had to start eating. "Jordan," Mr. Worden said. Irma, who happened to be passing at that moment, dropped her tray and gasped. In all the years she had been with the Wardens, she had never heard Mr. Worden address his son at the breakfast table. It seems we have matters to discuss," Mr. Worden went on. "I suggest we meet this evening." "This morning?" Mrs. Worden interrupted. "I shall return early from work and we shall meet this afternoon," Mr. Worden decided. 4:30 in the living room. Irma will bake a cake. We shall have tea as a family." "As a family?" Irma exclaimed. "Are you feeling ill, Mr. Worden, sir?" "Yes, I am feeling extremely ill, as a matter of fact," Mr. Worden replied, "but that is what we shall do." After breakfast, Mr. Worden went to work, Mrs. Worden went shopping, and Joe stayed at home. His thoughts were buzzing. He had seen the change in his parents. It was incredible. It was astounding. Could it be that somehow they had decided to believe him? Joe got dressed and went out feeling more alive than he had in weeks. But neither Joe nor his parents had a particularly nice day. "I'll come back." Mr. Worden tried to concentrate on his work in his office, but Granny's words echoed over and over in his head. Where would she pop up? Under his desk, in his filing cabinet, outside the window, even if it was 27 floors up. He reached for a cigar and rolled it against his cheek, taking in the aroma of the tobacco. "You're being ridiculous," he muttered to himself. Somebody touched him lightly on the shoulder. Mr. Worden screamed and jumped 3 feet into the air. The cigar slipped and disappeared into his left ear. Then he saw who it was. It was his secretary. She was looking at him in dismay. "Lock the doors," Mr. Worden whimpered. "Lock the filing cabinets. Lock everything. I want to be on my own." "I'll come back." Mrs. Worden was at the Brent Cross shopping centre. There wasn't anything she particularly needed, but she often found that buying things cheered her up. Once, when she was particularly depressed, she had bought 3 lampshades, a deck chair, an umbrella and 2 pairs of gloves without actually wanting any of them. She was in that sort of mood. She was thinking of buying a Swiss Army knife. It might come in useful if she ever decided to join the Swiss Army. She was standing on the escalator, travelling up past the central fountain, when she saw the figure standing at the top, waiting for her. She blinked. The yellow cheeks, the crooked smile, the gleaming eyes. It couldn't be. Mrs. Worden stared. The escalator carried her even nearer. It was. "No!" she screamed. "Go away, Mummy!" Turning round, Mrs. Worden clambered down the up escalator, pushing the other shoppers out of the way. People were shouting at her, trying to stop her, but she ignored them. She just had to get back down. She could feel the metal beneath her feet carrying her the other way. It was like her worst nightmare come true. "No!" she wailed again, shouldering her way past a pair of newlyweds and scattering parcels and packages everywhere. Then somehow her foot got tangled in the escalator. She dived forward, turning a somersault and landing spread eagle on the marble floor. "Is she all right? I think she's had a fit. She went mad." Security men were running towards her from every direction. With a soft moan, Mrs. Worden looked back up the escalator, and there it was. What had frightened her wasn't Granny at all. It was a full-size cardboard cutout of a dinosaur. It stood outside a video store with a sign reading, "Fantasia, buy it here." How could she possibly have made that mistake? Was she going mad? The first security guard had reached her. Everyone was looking at her. Mrs. Worden slowly began to laugh. "I'll come back." Jo saw Granny everywhere. During the course of the day, she had popped out of the fridge, out of the toaster, out of the dustbin and out of the fireplace. She had risen, dripping water out of the pond and clawed her way up through the lawn. The clouds had twisted themselves into Granny's shape. The birds in the trees had winked at him with her eyes. Twice Irma had become Granny, and even Wolfgang had momentarily borrowed her shadow. It was all imagination, of course. The real horror was still to come. That afternoon at 4:00, Mr. and Mrs. Worden sat in the living room with Jo and the tea that Irma had prepared. The Hungarian cook had decided that it was such an important occasion that she had gone quite mad. There were huge piles of sandwiches, homemade scones, sausage rolls, tea cakes, crumpets, cakes, biscuits, and even a jelly, but no one was eating. Mrs. Worden was a nervous wreck. Her hair was all over the place, and not only on her head. Mr. Worden had bitten all his nails and was now starting on his wife's. Even Jo was trembling. "I have called this meeting," Mr. Worden began, "because I have something important to say." "Yes, that's right," Mrs. Worden agreed. Then the telephone rang. Mrs. Worden sighed. "I'll get it," she said. She stood up and walked across the room. The telephone was standing on a little antique table. She picked up the receiver. "Hello, Maud N. Worden?" she said. There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Worden let out a great scream and dropped the receiver as if it were a scorpion she had accidentally grasped. Everyone stared at her. Jo had never seen his mother like it. Her hair, already in disarray, was actually standing up on end, like in a cartoon. Her eyes were bulging. All the colour had drained from out of her lips, including even the colour of her lipstick. "It's her!" she screamed. But the sound came out as a hoarse, strangled whisper. "That's nonsense," Mr. Worden muttered. "I mean, really, Maud, it's not possible." But Mrs. Worden could only point at the telephone with a wobbling finger. "It's her," she groaned again. "What did she say?" Mr. Worden burbled. "She said she was coming back." "It's not possible." Mr. Worden strode forward and snatched up the receiver. "Who is this?" he demanded. Another pause. Jo waited silently. He hadn't breathed since the telephone rang. Mr. Warden's mouth fell open. Now he was holding the receiver away from him as if it could suck him in down the wire. "No!" he shouted at it. "Go away! We don't want you!" And with that he hung up so hard that he actually broke the telephone into several pieces. "It was her," Mrs. Worden whimpered. "It was her," Mr. Worden agreed. "I'd know that voice anywhere." "What did she say?" Jo asked. "She said she was much better now and she'd be here in half an hour." "Much better?" Jo shuddered. "How can you be much better when you're dead?" Somewhere in the back of his mind he knew that the whole thing was ridiculous. Ghosts didn't announce their arrival by telephone. But seeing his parents as terrified as they were, he decided to go along with them. It was better than being left on his own. "Half an hour," Mrs. Worden whispered. And that was when the full horror of it hit her. "Half an hour!" she screamed. "Pack!" Mr. Worden yelled. Exactly 29 minutes later, the front door of Thackleby Hall burst open and the Wardens tumbled out, grasping 2 hastily packed suitcases. Mrs. Worden had thrown on her favourite fur coat. Mr. Worden was clutching his wallet, the family passports and his 18 favourite credit cards. His car, a green Mercedes, was waiting for them at the front. "In!" Mr. Worden yelled, wrenching open the door and catching his wife with it on the head. "Ah!" Mrs. Worden cried. "And me!" Joe shouted, piling into the back. He was actually enjoying all this. "Quickly!" Mr. Worden stabbed forward with the ignition key, missed and tried again. This time it went on. He twisted and the Mercedes coughed into life. At the same time, a taxi appeared, rumbling up the drive. "There! No! Ah! Mummy! Help!" Granny! The ghost of Granny was in the back seat. There could be no mistaking her, sitting there gazing out of the window, back from the dead. And this wasn't a dream. The entire family was seeing her at the same time. Mr. Worden wrenched the gear stick and slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The car leapt forward. Granny, sitting in the back of the taxi, frowned and pursed her lips. She had been released, fully recovered from the hospital just half an hour before. She had, of course, telephoned to say she was coming and had been quite unable to understand the hysterical reactions of her daughter and son-in-law. And where were they going now? One moment the Mercedes was tearing down the drive, heading straight for the taxi. Then it had swerved to one side, ploughed across the lawn and then burst through a hedge onto the main road. The taxi stopped and she got out. "That'll be 18 quid, love," the taxi driver said. With a snarl, Granny slammed the car door behind her, breaking both the window and the taxi driver's nose. She strode across the lawn, her hands on her hips, and gazed at the hole in the hedge. Where had they gone? They had gone, left her. How could they? Granny fell to her knees, lifted her hands to the sky and howled. The storm broke a few